Please do.
Okay, well, it is 12. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with an introduction before we get to hear Terry's wonderful talk. And thank you for joining us for the fourth in a series focused on words matter. This session is titled Empowering Voices: How Language Impacts Advocacy. We're asking everyone to please sign in on chat. We love it when you share your name and your email. And then after the workshop, within the next couple days or so, watch for an email from us with the slide notes and an evaluation. And we like you to know why Four Corners does these things. And we're hosting this workshop and many other educational opportunities that are part of our youth mental health project. This work is a result of the state mental, excuse me, I keep doing that. This work is a result of the state's maternal and child health assessment that found there needed to be more of an intentional mental health focus on our youth, especially those 10 to 19 years old, and preventing their death by suicide. Locally, we're working with many partners, and some of you on this call are those people, and we welcome many more also. And our site is set on building a more comprehensive approach to addressing youth mental health needs. We're grateful for the Title V Maternal Child Health Block Grant funds that enable us to provide this education today. And we are very grateful to Terry Easley for her consultative support for our project and for all the experience she brings in equipping us for helping youth to thrive. She's an awesome partner. A brief introduction, and then Terry can build on that with during her time. But Terry serves as a prevention specialist with Region 5 Systems, and a great way she benefits us, besides the consultative work, she is a facilitator for many important educational opportunities, including mental health first aid and WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And we are so pleased that she can share this content with you today. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm really honored and delighted to be here today. When Chris and I were visiting about me possibly being a part of this series and kicking around whether or not I'd be a good fit, we were, trying to figure out maybe what I could bring, to this series. And it's a little intimidating, being a part of something that Kate expected and that Quinn was a part of. But we kind of landed on this whole idea of advocacy. So I do work for the region, and there's a lot of familiar names and faces that are part of this. So that's really fun. We have coalition leads who are on today, and people that are part of our regional prevention system, which is great. But I'm really going to talk a lot more personally today, and how my journey through advocacy has changed, because I, kind of went through the ringer and had some personal lived experience that really helped me refocus how I look at all of that, and how we talk and how the language we use really does kind of affect that, because it all of a sudden affected me. And isn't that how we best learn, when we have our own experiences? So my work as a preventionist certainly informs what I do, but really this will be more just sort of what I have walked through, really kind of more in recent years, because, the older we get, the more we're like, oh yeah, our experience has sort of taught us a lot. So please, you can unmute and ask questions or throw those into the chat. This is meant to be informal, and just kind of a thoughtful piece. I'm sure lots of you are probably further along in this journey toward, kind of realizing how some of this works than I am. So I welcome your insights as well. And, if you have any aha moments, to share those also. I think we really do learn collaboratively best. That's how it works in WRAP and mental health first aid and all of the other sort of trainings that we do as a part of our work in the region. So please feel free to share all of those. There'll be a few reflective exercises I was telling Chris and Angel and Sarah that I almost did breakout groups and then I chickened out at the last second. That's a lot to ask of you. As a fellow introvert, for all of you who are introverts, I had your back at the end, and decided not to do breakout groups with you at the last second. But I will ask you to put stuff in the chat when we get to some of that reflective stuff. So reflecting on your past experience, reflecting about, some things that have maybe you've experienced and what you thought about that. So that's kind of what you can look for as we move through the next 50 minutes or so. I'll leave a few minutes at the end if you have questions or thoughts you want to share, but you can also just share as we go along the way. I've got the chat open, so I'll kind of keep an eye on that as we go. So feel free to unmute or use that at any time. So empowering voices, how language impacts advocacy. I have lived in Lincoln my entire life. I'm the homebodyist of homebodies. I went to school here. I went to UNL. I met my husband in high school. So my suspicion is I'll be planted here my entire life, unless our kid leaves, then we'll follow him. If there are going to be grandkids someplace else, that would definitely cause us to uproot and follow. But our families are here. And so advocacy, my mom is a huge proponent of advocacy, like civil advocacy and all of that. And so I grew up being really familiar with that. She's really fond of saying, like, these people work for us. So she is no stranger to calling up, whatever representative and visiting with them and talking to people, whether that's at the city, county, state, federal level. She just isn't shy about any of that and expects us to all in the family be a part of that. So heaven help you if you're not registered to vote. She'll get you registered to vote immediately. So just watch that. If you ever meet her, she'll figure that out and get you signed up. And is really okay with whatever you decide to vote for, just as long as you do it. Government is run by the people who show up, is another thing she's fond of saying. So advocacy is not unfamiliar to me. And then, having gone into nonprofit work, I've been an advocate my entire career for kids mostly. So I did that at the Lincoln Council on Alcoholism and Drugs. We educated when we visited with our elected officials, because that's what you do when you're a nonprofit. And then I went into ministry for 8 years, and that advocacy continued. I was a parent coach. So I advocated informally for families and kids and did a lot of advocacy work, for them, both informally with the church, and then did a lot of work with them trying to get them connected to services and helped folks who didn't have a lot of contact with the system, figure out how to navigate that. So I was familiar because I had come out of the nonprofit world into the ministry world. And then when I came back to the region, all of that just picked back up again. So it wasn't unfamiliar to me, but like I said, I'll tell the story of kind of what happened a little bit later. But I want to kind of set the stage and do a little bit of definition work before we do that. Here are the learning objectives, which I think you probably all saw on the flyer. If you saw the flyer, we'll increase awareness of connection between perception, language, and actions. We'll talk about some real life examples and experiences. I'll encourage us to reflect on our own use of language and the impact it has on our efforts to support others. And we'll hopefully foster a deeper understanding of the role of language in shaping attitudes and behaviors. And then we'll do hopefully some practical insights for adopting maybe person first language, and then maybe not. I'll show you a few things that might challenge our thinking a little bit about that. And then cultivating a more inclusive communication approach, just as we move through our work, wherever it is that you work. So those are our learning objectives, which seems really audacious now that I reread that for an hour, but we'll see how far we get. So here's advocacy. So when I was looking for the definition, if I asked you all to throw what you think advocacy means into the chat, we'd probably get, similar things about what that means to us. The definition is any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, supports or defends, or pleads on behalf of others. That was the definition that landed the closest to what I feel like, advocacy is for maybe most of us. there are lots of different types of advocacy. The three types that I've had the most contact with are systems advocacy, which is where you're looking at policy and law and trying to change how systems function, whatever system that is, whether that's a government system or a behavioral health system or a school system. And then individual advocacy, so where one person or a group of people are, working on behalf of, a group of people within, however we're choosing to do that. So it could be, I'm advocating for a student within a school system, or, however we're choosing to do that. And then self-advocacy, where we advocate for ourselves. And all of that can be done formally or informally. There's lots of different ways for that to take place. And then when I dug a little bit deeper, just to kind of muddy the water, there's also case advocacy, peer advocacy, paid independent advocacy, citizen advocacy, statutory advocacy, healthcare advocacy, legal advocacy, victim advocacy. So you get the picture. Like, there's lots of different ways for advocacy to take place. So it's not like this is just a one and done type of deal, but I think when you hear the word, something probably pops into your head about what that has to look like. And if you are bound, if you work in an agency, then probably you have an idea of what that has to look like. Particularly if there's rules that govern what you can and can't do, like we have to fall within a certain set of guidelines, and here's what we can do and can't do because of how we're funded. A lot of times that, sort of boxes us in a little bit in certain types of advocacy. So, we have ideas about what that needs to look like in order for us to, maintain funding or follow the rules. I don't know how many of you are rule followers. I'm a rule follower. So I don't ever want to color outside the lines and get in trouble with any of that kind of stuff. But there's a broad, range or swath of things that advocacy can encompass. So I want you to take a second and kind of think for a second. Can you think of a time that somebody advocated for you somehow? And what made that advocacy effective? You can put this in the chat if you're comfortable. You don't have to say what they did, but what about that advocacy made it effective for you? Or what did you appreciate about it? What did you appreciate about what they did the most? Like, what was it about that advocacy that made you feel, that made you feel like that was really helpful to you? Can you think of anything or a time when somebody did something for you and advocated for you that you really appreciated? And what was it about that? What was it about what they did that you appreciated? Validation, thanks, Jackie. Validation is huge. I would agree. Heard and valued for who I am. Thanks, Chris. Yep, for sure. Thank you, Teresa. They didn't speak for me, but they amplified what I was needing. Amplified, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So thank you. It's like I paid you to say that. Like I planted you in the audience. That's excellent. Didn't speak for me, but amplified what I was needing. Validation. Thanks, John. Maybe notice as people might continue to throw things in there as you think about it, because I dropped it on you. You weren't expecting to have to kind of think about that. You'll notice what the answers that we've gotten have in common, and what they don't mention. Nobody's mentioning anything like super formal, like a policy was passed, or maybe a policy was passed. Nobody's gotten that specific, but people are talking about, I felt validated, I felt heard. Somebody really amplified something that I was needing. They all kind of have, there's tone that's in common here. And I would say all of the times that I've had contact with folks who, have had, or been the recipients of effective advocacy or been involved in advocacy that's been effective, that these are all threads that those experiences have had in common. Validation, especially, they felt worked with instead of having something done for. Um, and then that this whole idea of amplification, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we get kind of to the action steps at the end. So thanks a lot for kind of sharing that. I appreciate you. I appreciate your vulnerability there. So language, if you've attended any of the other sessions, they've talked a lot about language, person first language, the importance of language. Rachel Johnson, who did one of the other sessions, actually is one of our faith partners, is one of the participants in one of our faith partners groups. And she had a huge impact on me because she did a talk on changing our language early on with Faith Partners, and that is a program that we did as a part of our Partnership for Success grant that just ended this last September. We had it for 5 years in Lancaster County, and so we worked with faith communities around Lancaster County, and then kind of in the surround. Seward has had a training a couple of times to kind of generate teams within congregations or within their particular churches or communities to address whatever needs they felt like their church had. So behavioral health, prevention, like whatever it was that they felt like, here's what we need, like these teams come together to kind of address what those needs are. So Rachel's part of the Disciples of Christ team, which is sort of a super team. There's a lot of Disciples of Christ churches in and around Region 5. And she does a talk. She has contact with the Lincoln Regional Center. She's a chaplain there, and she is really passionate about being mindful about our language. And so she was the first person that I heard really talk about like eliminating the word crazy from our language and how often people use the word crazy. So when somebody brings that up, then it becomes like, it becomes like a thorn in your foot. Once somebody points it out, then you hear how often you say it. And I said crazy all the time, and not in a cruel way. I didn't think I was being cruel, but it was just a word that I said a lot to describe everything. And so after she said that, and I started hearing how often I used it, I thought, okay, I've got to quit. I work in behavioral health, crying out loud. Like that seems like a word that I can get rid of and replace with something else. And then I was surprised at how hard it was, to eliminate that. And I would catch myself, but I would catch it after it came out of my mouth. And so I had to do some work, to eliminate that. I replaced it with the word bananas. And actually, Sarah Kettlehake, asked me one time we were at a June Jam, a youth event, and she said, I noticed you say that word a lot. You have a thing with bananas. And then I explained to her, here's where that came from. I used it to replace the word crazy. If that tells you how often I said the word crazy. Now it sounds like I have a weird thing with bananas. But I use that and the word wild to replace that word because I feel like those are more respectful ways, to convey my meaning without, then making it sound like I'm using a word that is harmful to some people in the community or hurtful. And I wouldn't know that necessarily looking at folks. And so language is ever changing, ever shifting. Words and what words are hurtful or what words are impactful will always be on the move. And we're learning that all the time, as we move through this time when we are digitally connected. So ironically, as you're all sitting here digitally, it's as we are connected, as we are so connected as a society, language will move all the faster. And how people want to be addressed and what people find impactful or hurtful will change, and we'll hear that communication and be able to receive that feedback probably more and more quickly than ever before. Just as a matter of, because we are so connected and more widely connected, where before, I'm not sure, and actually you could throw into the chat, like what decade do you consider your growing up decade? 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, like throw into the chat where you feel like when did you grow up? Like I was born in the 70s, but I'm kind of an 80s baby. I was young in the 70s. I don't really remember. So throw in the chat for me when you felt like you grew up. The 70s. Nice. Who else? 80s. Yeah. 90s, 70s, 80s. I missed the hair. Yes, totally. The bangs, small bangs. 70s, 2000s, Sarah. 90s, 80s. All right. 80s. Oh, you're my people. Look at you guys. All right, so we've got Sarah, we've got a 2000s, we've got Jackie, we've got the 90s, we've got a lot of 80s, couple of 70s. So many of you, similar to me, grew up analog and are now living in a digital world. Sarah grew up digital. Maybe you grew up analog, but you grew up in a digital world. Jackie, you probably had a foot in both camps. But most of us grew up analog and now we're living digitally. So when we grew up, we didn't have like, we only got the news that we got, which will make sense to you because you lived that way too. Like we only, maybe you got the paper, we watched the evening news, maybe you watched 60 Minutes, or your folks watched 60 Minutes, and we depended on that stuff. Like that's how we got our news, and we had to wonder a lot. um, I don't know how many of you had encyclopedias and that's how you wrote reports, but we had the Encyclopedia Britannica and I remember writing reports off of that, which seems just absolutely wild now. I remember explaining that to my son and he looked at me like, that is absolutely the dark ages, lady. Like, I don't even know how you survived all of that. I'm like, I'm not sure either. But if you had explained to my 80s self that I would someday have Google, I would have thought that that was space age. Like I would have just not even believed that that was possible. So the rate at which things have changed has, exponentially sped up. And so language is along for the ride with all of that. So sometimes those of us who grew up in the 70s, 80s, and a little bit the 90s, sometimes we balk a little bit at that because it's not what we were used to. And so we are running a little bit to catch up. Even if you are tech savvy and you like the technology stuff, there's still some times where it rubs up against how we grew up, and we balk a tiny little bit at that fast shifting and that fast changing, where people who grew up now, our son was the year 2000 baby. He won't know any different. Like he'll always have to shift and change like that. So for that generation, it seems much easier for them because it's always been how they do life. So there are some drawbacks to that, but there are also some benefits to that because they're just used to it. So some definitions, which probably are familiar to you, but just in case there are things you haven't run up against before. Person first language puts the person before their diagnosis. So instead of saying a schizophrenic, we would say a person living with schizophrenia. And that's come around. That actually came about in, I think, the 80s, maybe the early 90s, and that was during the AIDS crisis, when people were really pushing back against the idea of feeling like a victim when people were diagnosed with AIDS, and saying, I'm not just a victim of my diagnosis. So they wanted to be referred to as a person living with AIDS as opposed to an AIDS patient or an AIDS victim. So that's actually where the whole idea came from, which I didn't know before really kind of doing a deeper dive to make sure I understood what I was reading. Like I have heard this for years, but I wasn't really sure what the genesis was, but that's where it came from, which was kind of neat to learn. More recently, there's kind of this push for identity first language, which is the opposite. So it leads with a person's diagnosis or disability, which seems wild in some cases because we think, why on earth would we do that? Haven't we spent all this time, saying, no, we lead with the person's personhood before a diagnosis or disability. So why would we go the other direction? But the whole idea behind this why we would lead in the other direction is comes actually out of the disability community in the main, where people are saying actually it's helpful if I say I'm an autistic man or I'm an autistic woman, because it's not something that I can leave behind. And if I don't lead, sometimes with my disability, then it gets dismissed. And people just say, well, you should be fine regardless of your disability. And sometimes I'm not. Like sometimes the accommodations I need are required and I can't just leave them behind. And so I might choose to lead with my diagnosis or my disability because it's necessary. And I need that to be front and center so that I can get the accommodations that I need. Which I thought, wow, that's the complete opposite of what we've been talking about and learning about all this time, that we would, do this identity first language instead of this person first language. And so I finished this slide with cultural humility always, because there's two opposing ideas, this person first or identity first, and which one should we do? And the whole idea being it's not an all or nothing deal. It's not like I would tell me which one to do and then I'll always do that. That's where we get into trouble, where we do this idea that it has to be one or the other, and we can't, and I'm never going to do the other one. I'm always going to do person first, or I'm always going to do identity first. And that's what I'm 100% of the time going to do. And that's where I think we start to get into trouble, because it really is more about this idea of approaching with humility and approaching with curiosity, and maybe letting the situation and the person who's having the experience be in the lead. And when we lead with curiosity in these situations, I think will maybe it will maybe deepen our impact and allow for some learning and allow for a lot more dialogue. And right now, I don't know if you feel this way the same way that I feel this way, but I feel like we are a society that it is either black or white, is this way or that way, and there's not a whole lot of reaching across the aisle anywhere. And it's you're either one side or the other, and if you don't agree with me, then I cancel you, or if you're not careful, you're going to get canceled. And we just live in a society where it just feels a little bit fraught. If you're not careful, you don't do the right thing, then you're out. And so I think part of, well, or one of the answers to that is this idea: if I lead with cultural humility, and I'm talking about culture with a really broad lens here, in the same way that we talk about advocacy with a broad lens, like not just where I'm from, but cultural in terms of neurodiversity, cultural in terms of if I'm living with disability, culture in all of those, in all of its iterations, and just approaching with humility and curiosity. If we approach with curiosity and humility, then that will change a lot of our experiences going forward, and allow for some learning, and maybe will change how some of these experiences land for us and for the people who we have those experiences with. So cultural humility, that is not easy to say always, as we go forward with some of these as we go forward with some of these experiences, and walk through some of these advocacy pieces that we might become involved with, or we come across situations where we feel like I should speak up, maybe for somebody I care about, or a group of people that I feel like I need to speak for, whether that's for work or because I care about this group, or somebody I know as a part of that, where I just feel like I need to be an upstander as opposed to a bystander with whatever it is I'm seeing. Nothing wants to advance. Come on. Oh gosh. There we go. So I had a conversation with our son. So we jokingly say we have 1.5 kids. Our son Dawson, he's 23, and then his best friend came to live with us when he was in high school. His mom moved out of the state, and he was a senior, so we said, why don't you just finish here? He'd been Dawson's best friend since middle school. We were really, really fond of him, and he could just finish high school and then go to college. And then he moved in, and then just didn't leave for like 5 years. So I said, by statute of limitations, that makes you ours. So he has more parents than he knows what to do with, but we tease that, one and a half, because really he has so many parents right now. But I had a conversation with Dawson, our son, and then Anthony was kind of sitting in the back wing there, about pronouns. And, Dawson was sort of there and listening to his dad and I have this talk. And when I talk about being from the 80s and things kind of making us uncomfortable, and I was just sort of walking through, pronouns on Zoom calls, and, like whether or not should we do that or should we lead with that in signatures. And he didn't typically jump into stuff like that. He was probably a freshman in college. It's COVID. So everybody was home. We were all kind of on top of each other. And he all of a sudden said, I have some thoughts about that. And I thought, wow, well, do tell. I'm super curious to hear what you think about that. And he's like, if you put your pronouns in your signature or in your Zoom window, and that was when Zoom was really new, um, we were trying to figure out a lot of things about video and all of that at that time. And he's like, if you do that first, then it makes you a safer person for everyone. So why wouldn't you do that? And I was like, well, wow, just go ahead and call me out, why don't you? It was a really great moment for everybody involved. It was great to see him kind of thinking that stuff through. It was really good for him to challenge me. When I talk about, sometimes kids in this day and age really are really quick to accept that stuff. Like the pronoun thing is just not a huge deal to many of them, because they think, well, yeah, that's what it is, and you should be fine with it. And why would you not? If you are a safe person, then why would you not do that? So everybody knows that you're a safe person. I know that you're safe, but they don't know that you are. And that got me started thinking about something that we teach in parenting. When we do parenting classes, where we talk about, when we help parents learn about discipline, invariably those classes would be packed. I mean, that surprises no one, I'm sure. And how that always worked when I was in my ministry role, when I was advocating for families, was we would do baby dedication. So they would all show up with these sweet babies and carriers, and they were so dear. I loved those parents, because they would just have these sweet babies and they would be holding them, and it was so sweet. They just had stars in their eyes. You could tell they were just so in love with this whole journey that they were on. And then the first class we did, that was kind of about, setting up how are we going to discipline and how are we going to move forward as a family. What happened when the kids were 3, that class never failed to have 60 people in it. Packed. Because I don't know the last time you had a 3-year-old, but it's something. It's not the 2s, it's the 3s and 4s, where things kind of get a little out of control. And my favorite thing that ever happened in one of those classes was a dad who was like, I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. He just looked tired and haggard. And he was like, and I feel like I need an exorcism. And I kind of startled and laughed. And a dad at the next table goes, I know a good one. And I thought, I have no control here whatsoever. It was just completely off the cuff. And the whole table, the whole room kind of laughed. And that was sort of how it goes with 3 and 4-year-olds. They have babies. It's so sweet and quiet. And then at 3 and 4, the rubber hits the road and things are just kind of wild. But we spend time talking about behavior modification, and trying to change behavior is like playing whack-a-mole. You will wear yourself right out if you've ever played that game where you hit the moles with the rubber, mallet, which is really cathartic sometimes and fun and will wear you out, but it's an impossible game to win. Like, you can't ever win whack-a-mole. And you can't ever really win at behavior modification. And so when we talk to parents about that, we say, okay, it's like an iceberg, and behaviors are like melting an iceberg with a hairdryer. Where you really have to start is belief. So go way down, and 80% of an iceberg is under the water, and that's where beliefs are. So beliefs drive values, and values drive attitudes, and attitudes drive behavior. So I left attitudes out of here, but if you look at the top of the slide, this is true too of when we change language. My belief drives my values drive my behavior, and we talk about language change, or this change of how do I see myself? Am I a safe person? If I am, then why would I not be okay with changing my language? That goes back all the way back to my beliefs. And so I had to do some challenging work with myself. So the words on this slide come from, I believe, the citation's on a later slide, so we'll make sure I get that to you. But I loved how they said they're addressing the kind of perfect person first, identity first stuff. They said the rule is to put the word person first before the disability, diagnosis, or condition, in order to emphasize that those being referred to are people first, not just diagnoses or disabilities. For example, people with disabilities instead of disabled people. This is a perfectly lovely general tip. When in doubt, put the word person first, but identity is complex, way too complex for a rule like this to work without any exceptions. So the picture you're seeing here is from our time in ministry. This is a rousing game of duck, duck, goose that you're seeing. And you'll notice that the people sitting are all older, and the little guy in the back in the red sleeves is he's the it playing. He was a young person who was part of our ministry. This was a Wednesday night when we had a lot of kids come, and we had a thing called Wednesday night clubs, and I was the child care person, but my spouse at the time was the children's pastor. And so this little guy was part of I can't remember what club he was in, maybe Awana or something. There was a lot of sitting in the club he was in. And this little guy, there were lots of challenges that he lived with on a day-to-day basis. And I don't know if there was a diagnosis or not. I suspect there was, but I never heard what that diagnosis was. I don't know if he was on the road to getting that or not, or what was going on there, but he really struggled with being able to sit for any length of time. And so when we would play games at the beginning, prior to having to go and sit through class, which was the torture part for him, when we would play games, he would really love that part. But when we had to stop and go sit down, he would really react to that. It was really hard for him to do that. And he would just really struggle sometimes. And there would be meltdowns and tears, and sometimes there would be yelling. And so Derek, my husband, would oftentimes have to go and intervene with him, and he would have to come up and sit to kind of calm down and work through that. And he would say things like, "I'm bad," or "I'm stupid." And you could kind of hear him, he was third grade, old enough, like, you could tell that his language was a little delayed. But he would be expressing these big feelings, and knowing that he was struggling. He knew he was struggling, and he knew that we knew that he was struggling. Everybody knew, but he would be trying to express that, and you could hear what he was saying about himself. Like you could hear his belief, like he was expressing these things, and trying to explain to us the best way he knew how. Like, I know that this isn't how this is supposed to go. And so one night we were having a similar thing happen. They had been playing Duck, Duck, Goose. He never got to be it because there were hundreds of kids. Of course, not everybody got to be it. But he didn't get to be it. And when they all had to go and sit through the lesson, torture, he had a meltdown and was sitting up. And Derek was kind of walking him through. And he was like, "I'm bad. I'm bad. I know I'm bad." And Derek's like, "You're not bad. You're not bad. This isn't what this is about. We just want you to calm down so that you can go and be, in class with your friends." And one of these older young people, I call them kids, but because they're my kids' age, but one of these guys, they were the campus ops crew, the guys that cleaned the church. It was Lincoln Bereans, huge place, big campus. So we had lots and lots of people on the ops crew, came by and was like, "Hey man, what's up?" And he high-fived this little guy. And he said, "I wanted to be it for Duck, Duck, Goose." And he was like, "Oh, that's hard." And he was like, "Well, we could play with you." And so I get emotional. This was years ago. I could cry right now. So these 6 people came and sat down and took time out of their cleaning schedule to sit down and play 3 games of Duck Duck Goose, where this little guy got to be the it all 3 times, and they let him win, and it was the sweetest thing ever. I bet this picture is now well over 10 years old, and I will keep it until the day I die because it is my favorite thing ever, where a bunch of adults thought, he believes something about himself, and that's going to affect his values, and that affects his behavior, and it's not helping him at all, and his language is reflective of that. Like you can hear his belief in his language, when he's expressing that, I know I'm in trouble, and what I'm saying is I'm bad or I'm stupid, and that's not true. And there's a lot of work to be done. Like a game of Duck Duck Goose isn't going to fix all of that, but it sure did fix something that night. And it was balm for me, and it was certainly balm for my husband, who had lots and lots of interactions with this little guy, trying to fix things that were not working because he just had lots and lots of challenges. But belief is the foundation part. Like, what do I believe is true? About me, about the people I'm advocating for, about my language and how my language impacts, what I'm doing or what I'm a part of, and what I believe about, the importance of listening to people, and what I believe about, do I need to change something about what I'm doing? And sometimes the shift is not that big of a deal, and sometimes the shift can be really small. And sometimes we just need to sit down and play the Duck Duck Goose. So this was one of the sweetest memories I have from that time, and just thought it would be neat to share it with you. And hopefully he walked away feeling a little bit better, believing something different, like he was important enough for a bunch of people to sit down and play, because he certainly was. He's doing really well now. I'm friends with his mom on Facebook, and he is thriving. He's in high school now, which is wild, wild to me. So identity is complex. So no one rule is enough. So this is an example. The radicalcopyeditor.com is the citation. This is also from that blog. So person first language. So here's an example at the top. When a person says, I'm autistic and blind, and somebody says, no, you're not. You're a person with autism spectrum disorder and blindness. And the person says, no, I'm autistic and blind. And somebody corrects them and says, that's incorrect language. And the cloud with the lightning is frustration. Person-centered language, instead of person first, is, what language do you use to describe yourself? I'm autistic and blind. Cool. Should I use that language to describe you too? Yes, please. Thanks. Will do. So you can see where the change is. Like, I approach with curiosity and just ask, hey, what would you prefer I did? Here's what I prefer. Okay, should I just use that when I describe you? Yep. Okay, let's do that. And then we can move forward. So the difference is, instead of adhering to the rule, I'm going to approach with curiosity, and then let the person who I'm actually advocating for take the lead. So earlier when Teresa had mentioned amplification, this is in that same realm. Person-centered instead of person first. They're in the same category, but one is really kind of asking before it's just applying a rule. So I said I would tell you a story. This is communion. I don't know if this is another church thing, but it's much more recent for me. This is how this cracker changed my life. Not really, but kind of. So 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with celiac, which is a wheat intolerance. It's an autoimmune disease. When you get diagnosed, they just kind of throw you into the deep end of the pool. And so I went to Google, which was a terrible idea, because there's so much information out there about what you should and shouldn't do. Like, hey, change your conditioner, change your shampoo. It just was a lot right off the bat. And it was so overwhelming to me to try to figure out what I was and wasn't supposed to do. I knew I couldn't have bread, but that was about it. And so it was really, really a lot to kind of onboard. What's specific about me is you can have it from 1 to 4, which just has to do with the damage it's doing. It's like being pregnant. You can't be a little pregnant. You can't be a little celiac. You have it or you don't, but it has to do with what it's doing in terms of the autoimmune. But I'm asymptomatic. So when I get glutened, as they call it, I don't necessarily react. severely. I do if I eat pasta, that makes me really sick, but otherwise, because it has a lot of gluten in it, FYI. But otherwise, I don't really react a whole lot, which means I don't have to be super strict. I do because it's doing damage, but I don't feel it the way some people get really, really sick. So some people are like, lucky you. So yes and no. I guess lucky me because I don't get sick, but not so much because I just have to be disciplined because I have to be disciplined, which that's not, that hasn't worked out super great in some instances. However, so I grew up Catholic. So I don't know if anybody else is Catholic on the call, but First Communion is a huge deal in the Catholic Church. Huge deal. So you do First Confession, and it's a whole big thing, and you dress up in this really pretty white dress, and I mean it's a deal for in the Catholic Church. And so then I went to Berean, which is a gigantic church, not Catholic, but they pass communion. You don't even get out of your seat; they just pass it along because it's so big. So they pass the bread and they pass the juice, and so you don't even get up, and it's pretty, pretty organized, because otherwise it would be chaotic. But then when we left our ministry roles at Berean, we went to a church called City Light here in town, and City Light does it completely differently. City Light just does a cattle call. You get up when you're ready and you just go to the front, and it is complete, delightful chaos. Everybody just willy-nilly gets up and goes whenever they feel like it. So I, a rule follower, have no idea what's happening. My husband, who is kind of a chaos agent himself, thinks this is great fun. And so when we started going there, they just do bread, like a loaf of bread you get from whatever, Hy-Vee or wherever they go. And you dip it in the juice and then you go sit down and then wait, and then you all take communion together. So once we started there, I could see they had gluten-free crackers up, but they do communion kind of spread out the two sides of the stage, and the gluten-free crackers were kind of up at the middle, and nobody was up there. They weren't, because they hand out everything else, and I was like, how do you get that? So I kind of waited and was waiting, and nobody ever went up there, and nobody went up to get the gluten-free crackers. And I was like, how do you go get the gluten-free stuff? And Derek said, well, I don't know. Do you want me to go ask? And I was like, no, somebody will go. Well, nobody went. And so that happened a couple weeks in a row. And he's like, why don't you go ask? And I was like, you need to leave me alone. Like, I will go when I'm good and ready, which seems ridiculous, I'm sure. You think, why would you not go ask? Well, when you are gluten-free, there's a lot of things that I learned about advocating for myself that I hadn't previously known, despite all of my experience in advocacy, because people would say things like, so you can't have potatoes. And I'd go, oh, yeah, I can have potatoes. In fact, don't take French fries from me because it's one of the few things I can have. I can't have cake, but I can have potatoes. And then they'd say, so you can't have corn. Oh, no, I can have corn. I can have corn chips, nachos. Mexican food is one of the few things, actually. I can have that. And then they say, oh, so like you can't have rice. Yes, yes, I can have rice. I think you're confused. I think you think it's low carb. It's not low carb. It's actually just wheat. But actually, there's a lot of gluten and other things like soy sauce, and so you have to be kind of careful. And so I realize there's a lot of confusion. And if you're not living in it day to day, it's hard to understand. And so I realized that people were trying, like they were doing their best, but there was just a lot of confusion. I found that I got really tired. And I would go so far as to say there were times I was exhausted, trying to explain to people what I couldn't have. And so I would just bring my own food, and I would avoid things where I had to like go and be with people because there were restaurants I wasn't sure if I could go or if the menu would have anything on it that I could have, or it just got to be, it was a lot. And I had never experienced that in my life. And on top of that, I noticed when people, because people had trouble understanding what I couldn't have through no fault of their own, like for the first time in my life, I noticed people kind of withdrawing from me for the first time. And I don't think that was unkind on their part. I think they just didn't know what to do. So they just kind of pulled back from me, and I just kind of let it happen. And so when we got to this whole thing with communion, and Derek was like, just go ask. I was like, you leave me alone and I'll ask when I'm good and ready. And he was like, yes, ma'am. As he ran up and got his bread. It took me 18 months to finally ask. And the pastor at City Light is the sweetest person ever. But after finally 18 months, and we would sit there whisper fighting, he was like, you should just go ask. And I was like, you lay off. I'll go when I'm good and ready. Finally, I texted Ricky, And so I have a really dumb question, but how do you go get the gluten-free crackers? Because there's nobody up there, and quite frankly, it feels like charcuterie if I just go get it myself. And he was like, huh, he texted me back and he was like, I don't think I've ever seen anybody go up and get the gluten-free communion. And I was like, I can explain why, because nobody knows how. The very next week, it was moved over to the right side on the side that we sit. And there were instructions up on a slide, and he made an announcement from the stage, like, if you're gluten free, you come up and get the cracker. And, like, he just gave instructions for how to do that. And so I went up, I got my cracker. This is it. This is a picture of my very first cracker. So I sat down with it and took a picture of it. And then Derek elbowed me in the side, in the arm, and he goes, look. And three other people went and got gluten-free communion that day. And he was like, look, see what you did. And so I thought, oh my gosh, it was very emotional. And then the whole thing continued because you would just go up and then go around and sit down, and you wouldn't do the blessing, like the body of Christ, which was given up for you, the blood of Christ, which was shed for you. And so it went on after that for about a year, where Ricky's like, just jump back in line. And I'm like, they don't know what to do with us when we jump back in line. They look at you like, what are you doing? So just 2 weeks ago, they realized that we weren't getting back in line, and they worked with the communion people, and then they made an announcement from the stage, to say, hey, just jump back in line and they'll say the word. So I just got to have normal communion for the first time 2 weeks ago. So it changed the way I advocate, because I learned, because of my wheat intolerance, through the power of that lived experience, how tiring it is when you're living it day in and day out. So how exhausting it can be. And really, on a scale of 1 to 10, this is like a 2. Like, people who are living with, whether they're living with a disability or some sort of diagnosis or whatever, all the other things you can be advocating for, like, this is not a big deal. Big deal to me, but not a big deal in the grander scheme. But if I'm that tired, what must it be like for people who are constantly advocating for accommodations that are life altering? What must that be like? So it changed the way I advocate. It changed how I approach people. Now, when I enter into those conversations with folks, I say, hey, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me. I just kind of want to understand. And I bet there's a lot of things I don't know. I won't flinch. So whatever I can do to help you, like, help me understand so that I can be a better assistance, because I have nearly wept when people have stepped into that for me and just said, I will do what I need to do to help you, whether that means I have gluten-free food available, whether that means we figure out where you can go eat, whatever that means. Like, I have really appreciated people who have stepped up and advocated, individual advocacy for me, in that way. And systems advocacy at work, our HR department, we do quarterly lunches. When I finally disclosed at work that I was dealing with this, the HR department stepped up on a systems level and made sure, like, there was a system in place so that I could say, hey, I need a gluten-free accommodation, and they just step up and do that for me. All I have to do is, I'm going to be there, and then they just take care of it. So it changed how I approach those things, with a lot more curiosity and a lot more sensitivity, because I realize now that sometimes it is tiring, and how tiring that is, and also why sometimes people come in hot, and with a lot of energy. It really did a lot to change how empathic I am in those situations, because I realized how kind of raw I was, just based on, I have to get this stupid cracker, and it's taken me a year and a half to go get it. I don't know how many of you remember this. The gentleman that kind of, with the skid loader, he was in a parking lot, and he was throwing cars into other cars. This happened in January. This went viral, nationwide, and even probably past all of that. And I was hearing people say some really unkind things about this person. And he's dating a cousin of mine. So I know him. And it was really interesting to me to listen to people talk about him. And I'm not going to disclose all the things we know about what's happening. It's a mental health issue. I, there's a lot going on there. But when I would say, hey, we actually know him and he's dating my cousin. And Derek would just say, we're related to him. And you would just hear people go, like, stop talking immediately. And all of a sudden you could just see him become a person in their eyes. Um, and so it was interesting to me to listen. I've never been a part of something that's gone viral before. And it was interesting to me to watch when somebody becomes human in the eyes, like when somebody goes from being a meme or a joke, or like we're angry at this person because he did something scary, which he did. That's true. When he goes from being that person to being a person because somebody I know knows him, like that shift is something that was wild to watch. So I only use this example because it's so fresh for us. And then also because everybody knew about this, like everybody knew about this. And I'd never been a part of something like that before. And because he's connected to a cousin with the same last name as us, everybody was asking me, like a shocking number of people asked me about this, and then wanted to know like all about that. So it was a chance for us to do a lot of advocacy for mental health, but then also to advocate for, hey, just because somebody does something, it doesn't mean he doesn't need to, there's consequences for our choices, but it also doesn't mean that he's not a person with a diagnosis, and a person who probably needs some help. So there's a lot we can do to kind of advocate when stuff hits close to home. So last, I want to kind of talk before we reflect about when advocatees, which is not a word, don't cooperate. So what do we do when we're advocating? So as an example, if I were to eat gluten, and somebody had been advocating for me, they would look at me and be like, what are you doing right now? Like we've done all this work to do gluten-free stuff for you. Now here you are eating a breadstick. Like, why are you doing that? And that you could apply that to anything. People who are sober and they take a drink, or somebody who's, struggling with their mental health and they quit taking their meds, like you name it. Like these exist all over the place when we talk about advocacy. What happens when people don't cooperate the way that we think we should as their advocates? So we have to check our messaging, because why, if we're coming in over the top, then we're maybe putting people on a pedestal that they don't belong on and shouldn't be on, because people will be imperfect. I'm going to eat a breadstick, so just brace yourself for that. And other people are going to live their lives, and it's okay. But if I as an advocate go in so hard that I put people on a pedestal so that if they don't act the way that I've said think they should act, or the way that I've set them up to act, that's going to be a hard thing for them, then I need to check my messaging as an advocate, because I'm setting them up for failure, which is the very opposite of advocacy. And check the standards I'm holding them to. And then also checking my assumptions. Thank you, Chris. Sorry about that. Then as a reflection, and you guys can do this on your own, because I think this takes more than just a minute. What does it mean to be included? Like, what does inclusion really mean? And then I have just a few things that you can kind of consider, to add to your thoughts and reflections here, since we're coming to the end. But as you think about what it means to be included, for me as somebody who's gluten-free, it means when people just make the effort to include me and have a gluten-free thing that's maybe not a salad, because that's always the go-to, but when somebody makes the effort. So what does it mean to you to be included? Or has somebody been really clever about how they've included you? And I talked about at the beginning that we would talk about amplification. This is a great way to really boost inclusion. So amplifying their voices, bringing them to the table. And that's a struggle. Like, it's not always easy to bring folks to the table, for a host of reasons, but do the work to bring them there, or go to their tables if you can. Curating our echo chamber. So if you're uncomfortable, then that probably means you're doing a good job. So whether that's on social media or wherever you're at, if all of the voices are agreeing with me, then that probably means I'm not doing a good job of pulling in disparate voices who are saying other things. So when I talk about curating our echo chambers, that just means have lots of other voices speaking so that I can hear other points of view. And that will help kind of figure out, am I amplifying or am I only hearing things that sound good to me? And so if you're uncomfortable, that's good. That's probably where we need to be. and then listen, 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 and then listen a little bit more, and then learn how to decenter ourselves, so that we're not the center of our own advocacy stories. If we're trying to advocate for somebody else, if you're doing self advocacy, then yes. But the minute we're advocating for somebody else, then we should be decentering ourselves and letting somebody else be the center of that. So do the work to figure out how to decenter, and that's a whole other thing, a whole other workshop to kind of learn to do the work to decenter. So do the work to figure out, how can I amplify the voices and the experiences of the people that I want to advocate for, in a sensitive way that means a lot to them. All right, I took you right to the end. I can hang around if anybody has questions or wants to share. Sorry, Chris. I had a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Terry,
Yeah.
for all that you shared. It really was extremely valuable. Great examples too. And thank you to all the participants too that joined in today. And as Terry mentioned, we want to answer any questions or comments. And so thanks, Terry, that you're willing to stay on for a bit. This has been recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. And then be sure to visit our upcoming events page. Thanks, Sarah, that you put that in the chat box. We have many upcoming events, and one for sure that we want you to have on your radar. Our next larger thing is our workshop, March 22nd, Building Resilience to Strengthen Youth and Families. We sure would love you to join us. It's going to be hosted in Seward. The flyer should be coming out by the end of the week with the registration link. So we welcome each of you to join with us in making it easier for people, especially our youth, to thrive. Contact me or Sarah with your ideas, and if you would like to join in with us and others in this important work. So thank you again.